The porch light flickered as I pulled into the cabin driveway, Mother's Day, and not one call from my son or his wife. Still, I left the engine running, just sat there, staring at the front door they didn't know belonged to me. As the bulb buzzed above the steps, that cold, artificial light made the silence feel deliberate. While it buzzed, I thought about the gifts I'd wrapped for them last year, handwritten notes they never answered. The same daughter-in-law who posts about chosen family had erased the woman who raised her husband. That's when I knew the best revenge was arriving first and leaving the light on for no one. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence, it lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. I woke up before the sun the way I always do on Mother's Day. Habit mostly, years of making breakfast for a husband who left too early for work, and then for a boy who eventually stopped needing anything from me except quiet applause. The house felt colder than usual, so I reached for the blue sweater folded at the foot of the bed, the one Eva once pointed at and said, "Nana, that color makes your eyes look like lake water." I hadn't worn it in months, it slid over my shoulders like a memory. Downstairs, the kettle took its time heating. I set the mug by the window, my favorite seat, the one where I've watched decades of seasons change. The street was unusually still. No joggers, no dog walkers, not even the distant hum of someone mowing too early, just the soft whistle of wind and my own breathing. I kept my phone face up on the table, lit screen, no banners, no sounds. I told myself it was early, people sleep in on weekends, especially people with plans, especially people who post their plans online before they even start them. By 9, the tea had gone cold. I made a fresh cup, moved to the couch, and picked up the book I'd been pretending to read for weeks. Every few lines, my eyes drifted back to the phone, still blank. 10 arrived, 11, noon. The kettle shrieked to remind me I'd turned it on again and then walked away from it entirely. I shut it off, let the steam fade, and forced myself to breathe through a tightness in my chest that I refused to name. It wasn't until I opened social media, something I try not to do because it's like watching life happen through a window I didn't know I was standing behind, that the quiet finally made sense. There it was, Mara's feed. Brunch table, orange mimosas, a stack of pancakes so tall it looked ridiculous. Daniel sitting beside her, scrolling through his phone mid-photo. And Eva, sweet Eva, leaning toward the edge of the frame, expression half annoyed, half bored. I recognized that look. It was the same one she wore when she was forced to sit through things she had no say in. Caption: celebrating the moms who make life beautiful, blessed. Comments flooded in: pretty plates, perfect family, so lucky. My name wasn't anywhere, not even in the vague way people gesture at extended relatives. I clicked the photo again, zooming in on Eva's face. There was something in her eyes, a softness pulled tight around the edges. I wondered if she'd asked about me, I wondered if she'd been told not to. The first sting hit then, quick, small, like a needle prick. Not anger, not yet, something quieter, something that tasted like an old disappointment I'd swallowed too many times. I set the phone down, face down now, as if it had betrayed me. The house felt even smaller suddenly, like the walls were drawing in with every heartbeat. I needed air, so I walked to the back closet, the one I rarely open anymore. Winter coats, boxes of decorations I haven't put up since my husband passed, the faint smell of cedar he always insisted on adding to every corner of the house. Behind a folded quilt was the tin box. It was heavier than I remembered, cool in my hands. The lid squeaked when I opened it. I'd always meant to oil it. Inside, everything was exactly as it had been the day I placed it there. A ring of keys with a faded red tag, a folded sheet of paper with numbers and coordinates, and a notarized deed with ink so crisp it still looked new. My name only, printed at the top. A cabin tucked away where no one ever thought to ask. A place that had once been meant for both of us, then somehow became the only thing left that was entirely mine. I traced the edge of the deed with my thumb and felt a warmth I hadn't felt all day, not joy, not triumph, but recognition. Of myself. Of someone I used to be before I became the person others expected. Outside, a car drove past, the sound startling in the quiet. My phone buzzed against the table, once short, almost reluctant. For a heartbeat I froze. A message, a call. A belated memory. I didn't move to check, not yet. Instead, I closed the tin box gently, held it against my chest, and let the moment stretch, full and fragile, like something waiting to become real. I had a feeling the day was about to split open, one way or another. I drove north without checking the phone again, kept it buried in my purse, screen face down so I wouldn't see the shape of whatever excuse was waiting. The farther I got from my neighborhood's neat lawns and manicured lilacs, the easier it became to breathe. By the time the highway narrowed into 2 lanes, I felt something inside me loosen, not forgiveness, not release, but the simple relief of distance. The sky softened as I turned onto the old county road, clouds drifting like slow sails. I followed the coordinates the way I always had, by memory, past the broken fence post, past the maple grove that turned molten gold every October. Then the gravel path appeared, half hidden under years of fallen needles and overgrown brush. The sun cut through the trees in thin, perfect rays, as if lighting the way for me alone. The tires crunched quietly as I eased forward. I swear I could hear my husband's voice the way I used to when he narrated every backroad, as if hosting a nature documentary. Follow this bend, care, listen, hear that, that's where the lake opens up. He always knew how to make the ordinary feel like a discovery. And then I saw it. The cabin stood exactly where it had always been, square and steady and warmed by the afternoon light. No sagging roof, no broken windows, just the gentle stillness of a place kept safe by time and the fact that no one else knew it existed. I stepped out of the car and the air hit me, pine, lake water, and a hint of the wood smoke that had seeped into the beams long before we ever signed the deed. For a moment, I didn't move. I let the quiet settle over me like snowfall. Inside, the cabin felt untouched. The furniture we chose together was still arranged the way we left it. His favorite flannel blanket draped over the armchair. My dog-eared books lined up on the shelf, leaning against one another the way old friends do. I ran my hand along the mantel, brushing away dust, and felt that same warmth I'd felt when I opened the tin box. Recognition. A place where I didn't have to perform motherhood or politeness or forgiveness on command. I opened all the windows, let fresh air rush in. Then I knelt by the hearth, arranged the kindling, and lit a small fire. The flame caught quickly, licking up the dry wood until the room glowed with that familiar amber light. I sat in front of it, legs folded beneath me, and exhaled a breath so deep it almost startled me. I hadn't realized how tight my lungs had been, how much I'd been bracing for disappointments disguised as obligations. While the fire settled into a steady crackle, I unpacked a few books I'd thrown into my bag, poetry mostly, and the journal I keep meaning to fill. I placed them on the table and felt an unexpected steadiness rise in me, like I had arrived somewhere I'd been trying to reach for years. The phone buzzed inside my purse. I didn't reach for it immediately. I let it buzz again and again. Eventually, curiosity nudged its way in, so I pulled it out. A notification from Mara's feed hovered on the lock screen. Celebrating moms who truly show up. Sparkling heart, grateful heart, real family. My stomach tightened. The hollowness practically radiated through the screen. She never missed a chance to perform sincerity as long as there was an audience applauding. Another notification appeared underneath. A text. Daniel, 3 days late. Sorry, been swamped. No mention of the day he forgot. No question about how I was. Just a placeholder of a sentence, tossed out the way someone might toss spare change into a jar they no longer look at. I placed the phone face down on the table the same way I had in my living room days earlier, except here the act didn't feel like betrayal, it felt like choice. Outside, the wind rustled through the pines. The lake carried a faint shimmer through the trees, catching what was left of the afternoon light. I stepped onto the porch, hands in the pockets of my blue sweater, and let the stillness wrap around me. For the first time in a very long time, I felt myself standing in a life that belonged to me, not the one I'd been reduced to. And just as I started to close the cabin door behind me, the phone buzzed again. One word previewed on the screen. Mom. I didn't touch it. But the sound lingered in the doorway like a question I wasn't ready to answer. The next morning, the cabin was still colder than I liked, so I drove into town for breakfast, the kind of small-town diner where the blinds are always half bent, and the smell of butter never quite leaves your clothes. The waitress with the cherry-red nails poured my coffee without asking. She must have recognized me from years back. Or maybe she simply recognized the look of someone who needed a warm cup and quiet. I sat at the corner booth near the window, where I could see the lake peeking between the bakery and the bait shop. The water was calm, still silver from the early hour. I pulled out my phone, half hoping for nothing, half dreading something. Of course, there it was, more noise from people who never asked how I was but always assumed they understood. Mara had posted again several times, actually. Family selfies, brunch leftovers packaged in neat little boxes, Eva's face mostly cropped out or blurred by motion, and then a fresh post, a throwback Thursday that wasn't even Thursday. A picture of Daniel's father. My husband, his arm around a much younger Daniel, both of them holding fishing rods by this very lake. Caption: "We miss you every day." We. As if she'd known him longer than the handful of holiday dinners where she sat more interested in photographing the meal than asking him questions. As if grief were hers to display like a curated gallery. I felt something inside me twist, not pain exactly, but clarity. A kind of cool, level understanding of how effortlessly people rewrite a story when they think the original author isn't watching. I pulled my journal from my purse and wrote one word across the top of the page. Selective. That's what it was, not malice, not cruelty, just a steady, practiced narrowing of attention until only the parts that benefited them remained, and the rest, including me, drifted quietly out of frame. I closed the journal and ordered oatmeal, though I barely tasted it. The diner hum filled the silence around me, forks clinking, two men discussing last night's game, the soft hiss of the espresso machine. It was comforting in a way I hadn't expected, background noise without emotional debt. My phone buzzed again, but this time the notification was different, a faint vibration, softer, hesitant. A private message. Eva. Are you okay, Nana? I tried to call, Mom took my phone. My breath caught in my throat. Eva had always been the one who noticed things, even the things adults tried to hide behind polite smiles and busy schedules. It didn't surprise me that she'd tried calling. It did surprise me that Mara felt the need to control even that. My fingers hovered over the keyboard longer than they should have. I didn't want to worry her. I also didn't want to pretend everything was fine. So I wrote the only thing that felt honest and right and simple enough for her to hold. I'm safe, that's enough for now. 3 dots appeared, then vanished. Appeared again, disappeared again. She was thinking, hesitating, or someone was hovering near her. Then nothing, no reply. I sat there a long moment, staring at the empty chat bubble, wishing I could shield her from the family habits she'd been born into, the performance, the image, the constant needing to prove something that never should have required proof. When my oatmeal cooled and the coffee pot ran dry, I paid my check and drove back to the cabin. The quiet greeted me like an old, steady friend. Inside, I pulled a shoebox from the hall closet, the one filled with decades of family photos. Some were sun-faded, some still sharp, some creased at the corners from being held too often. I spread them across the kitchen table, the way you might lay pieces of a puzzle you're finally ready to solve. One by one, I began sorting. Photos that held joy, the real kind, went into a small leather binder I hadn't used in years. Pictures of Daniel as a toddler, his hair sticking up like static. Eva holding a paintbrush at age 6, freckles blooming across her cheeks. My husband laughing so hard his eyes disappeared into crescents. These stayed. And the others, the ones taken after Mara began editing smiles, staging moments, trimming edges, I set aside. Not to destroy, but to put somewhere they couldn't bruise me anymore. By the time I finished, the sun had dipped low, turning the table golden. I closed the binder gently and felt something shift inside me, a quiet reclaiming. I wasn't erasing history, I was choosing the parts that deserved to be held close. Then my phone buzzed again, a single sharp vibration that made the hair on my arms rise. A new message. But not from Eva. Daniel, Mom, can you just tell me where you are? I stared at the screen, the question hanging there like a doorway I wasn't sure I wanted to walk through. And for the first time, I wondered not what he wanted from me, but what I still owed him. Daniel's message lingered on my screen long after it stopped glowing. I set the phone on the mantel, screen face down, and stepped outside before I could second-guess myself. The air carried that early summer coolness that still smelled faintly of spring, damp earth, pine resin, the sharp sweetness of lake water. I walked toward the shoreline, the same worn path my husband and I used to take every time we came up here. The grass brushed lightly against my ankles. When my feet reached the edge of the sand, I kicked off my shoes and let my toes sink into the cold grit. The shock grounded me more than anything else had. In days. The lake rippled gently, soft waves tapping the stones like a quiet heartbeat. And with that sound came a memory, one I'd tucked away carefully, maybe too carefully. After his funeral, I'd found an envelope hidden inside the dresser drawer he used for his fishing journals. My name written in that small, earnest handwriting he never quite managed to improve, no matter how many times he wrote notes to his students or lists for the grocery store. Inside was a single page. Care. The cabin is yours, not ours, yours. Go when it's quietest. Go when the world forgets you, and remember yourself there. Love, A. I hadn't cried when I read it the first time. I think I was too numb then. But standing barefoot on the shoreline with wind pushing my hair across my face, the memory hit me with an ache that was both heavy and strangely comforting. He had known. He had somehow seen the edges of my loneliness long before I admitted it to myself. A gull shrieked overhead, then silence again. When I finally walked back toward the cabin, the phone on the mantel blinked with 2 new voicemails. I didn't need to hear them to know the tone. Daniel asking without asking, checking in without really checking in. That same soft insistence he used whenever he sensed something slipping out of his control. Instead of answering, I grabbed my gloves from the porch rail and headed around back to the storage shed. The tools were still exactly where he and I had left them years ago. A rusted rake, 2 axes, a stack of old rope he swore he'd need someday. I pulled out the hatchet and started clearing the brush that had grown wild around the cabin. The work was slow but satisfying. Each branch cut away felt like peeling back a layer of something overgrown inside me. I trimmed back the pine limbs, tossed them into a pile, and split the fallen branches into firewood. The rhythm steadied me: lift, swing, crack, repeat. Voicemails would keep, this moment wouldn't. After an hour or so, I wiped my forehead and drove into town to buy oil for the squeaky tin box hinge and maybe a few new tools. The local hardware shop was exactly the same as I remembered: dusty aisles, jars of mismatched screws, the faint smell of rubber and old lumber. A man behind the counter looked up from a ledger, squinting slightly. "You're back," he said. I blinked. "Sorry." He smiled, pointing a pencil in my direction. "You're the lady who bought that cabin off Route 7, paid in cash, whole thing in one afternoon." I laughed softly, a little embarrassed, a little proud. "That's me." "Not many folks do it that way anymore," he said. "Quiet buyer, quiet life." I liked the way he said it, not as judgment but as acknowledgement. I nodded. "Quiet suits me." He rang up my things, bagged them carefully, and wished me a good day. Outside, the sun had climbed high, warming the sidewalk. I sat in the car for a moment, staring at the steering wheel, listening to the echo of his words. Quiet life. Yes, that was exactly what I'd come here to reclaim, or maybe discover. Back at the cabin, I spent the rest of the afternoon stacking firewood neatly against the wall, sweeping the porch, brushing sand from the steps. Every task felt like placing another stone back in the foundation of something I'd neglected too long. When I finally stepped inside, dusk already settling, the phone on the mantel pulsed with a new notification. Another voicemail, this one shorter. But what froze me wasn't the missed call, it was the text preview right beneath it. "Daniel, Mom, someone said they saw you." "Saw me? Up here? How?" The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the shadows deeper. And for the first time since arriving, I felt something I hadn't expected. The faint outline of a presence closing in. Daniel's text stayed on my screen like a thumbprint I couldn't wipe away. "Someone said they saw you. Not are you okay? Not I'm sorry. Just surveillance disguised as concern." That was the moment, the precise second, something inside me settled. Not anger, not fear, something far calmer: decision. Early the next morning, I drove into Traverse City with the estate binder I hadn't opened since my husband died. It sat on the passenger seat like a coiled truth: legal documents, bank accounts, the deeds, the trust structure we once built assuming our son would inherit both our history and our gratitude. But history, I realized, only works when someone remembers to show up for it. The attorney's office was a modest place above a bakery that smelled of warm cinnamon. The receptionist glanced at my binder and gave me a small, knowing nod. the kind people give when they recognize a certain kind of resolve. She led me to a conference room with a wide oak table and a view of the bay. The attorney, a soft-spoken woman named Hollis, shook my hand and sat down across from me. "You mentioned revisions," she said gently. I opened the binder. The pages looked too clean, too optimistic, a plan built for a future that no longer existed. I slid the documents toward her. "I'd like to make some changes," I said. Her eyebrows rose slightly. "Changes or restructuring?" "Rewriting," I answered, "completely." We went line by line. I removed Daniel and Mara from the default inheritance not out of spite, but because generosity without reciprocity becomes servitude. In their place, I added conditional clauses not based on age or chronology or obligation, but respect, presence, humanity. Then I turned to Eva's section. "Leave it intact," I told her, "but add a timeline she can unlock through choices, not birthdays." Hollis looked at me over the rim of her glasses, studying me without judgment. "You're making this very intentional." I nodded. She's the only one who's tried. When we reached the deed to the cabin, I felt my posture shift, straighten. My husband's handwriting flashed in my mind, "Go when it's quietest." This place had been his gift, a sanctuary, and a sanctuary couldn't survive entitlement. I tapped the page. "This property stays in my name alone, no access, no rights, not until after I'm gone," and even then, I met her eyes, "Only if a written consent exists, signed by me." She leaned back. "You want this airtight." I felt the strength rise in my voice before I heard it. "Bulletproof." She drafted the revisions, printing page after page until the future looked different, not colder, not crueler, just more honest, more mine. 2 hours later, I walked out of the office with the binder tucked under my arm, the weight of it feeling different, calmer, as if I had finally stepped into a version of my life that didn't shrink to accommodate others. Outside, the wind blew sharp off the bay. I pulled my sweater tighter, breathed in the cold, and felt my husband in that breath, not as grief but as presence. Back at the cabin, night had already settled. The sky above the pines was a deep blue streaked with faint traces of violet. I carried the old stack of Mother's Day cards, the ones from years when Daniel remembered because Mara reminded him, out to the fire pit. Some bore flowery printed messages. Some had signatures without notes. One had a scribbled "Love ya" that looked rushed, last minute. I sat on the cold stone edge, struck a match, and held it to the corner of the oldest card. The paper curled immediately, flame rising with a soft, hungry whisper. One by one, I fed the fire each card, watching the ash lift into the air like bits of finally released obligations. When the last flame died down, I felt an unexpected lightness, not joy but clarity. I stood, brushed the soot from my hands, and turned toward the cabin. My phone was buzzing inside. Not a text, not voicemail. A call, Daniel's name glowing across the screen. And this time, the ringing didn't sound like concern. It sounded like pursuit. The call from Daniel kept ringing long after I'd stepped back outside. I let it echo into the night until it died on its own. When the silence returned, it felt heavier, fuller, as if the air itself knew something had shifted between us. Clouds were gathering over the lake, thick and low. By the time I climbed into bed, the wind had started its restless pacing through the pines, brushing their branches together in sharp whispers. The first crack of thunder hit around midnight, so sudden the windows rattled in their frames. I lay still, listening to the storm roll toward me like a slow, deliberate warning. When the second thunderclap shook the cabin, the power flickered, once, twice, then everything went dark. It didn't scare me. Darkness had been my companion long before this night. I got up, found the oil lamps we stored years ago, and lit 2 of them, one for the kitchen, one for the chipped table where my husband used to sit with his notebooks. The warm amber glow filled the cabin, turning the storm's violence into something distant, almost cinematic. Outside, rain slammed against the roof in steady sheets. Inside, the quiet felt earned. I pulled one of my husband's journals from the bottom shelf and placed it beside the lamp. The leather cover was worn soft at the edges. As I opened it, the smell of old paper drifted up, cedar, ink, lake air. Notes about fishing tides, sketches of birds he'd seen, small doodles of the 2 of us on the porch, legs propped on the railing. Halfway down a page, I found a line I'd forgotten. We always said we'd come back here. We will, even if it's just you. I exhaled a laugh, the kind that felt like it had been trapped under my ribs for months. The storm cracked again overhead, but it couldn't drown out the warmth blooming in my chest. My phone buzzed on the table. Maura this time. Her post came through even with the weak signal. It's scary when people disappear on purpose. The phrasing was dramatic, pointed, meant for an audience, not for understanding. She wanted eyes on her fear, not clarity about mine. Before I could dismiss the screen, another call came in. Daniel. No V. Voicemail option, just a call that rang and rang until it cut off abruptly, as if he didn't want to give me the chance to ignore him in any permanent way. I turned the phone face down. The storm grew louder, the kind of roar that makes you feel small in a strangely comforting way. I carried the second lamp up the narrow attic stairs, curious whether anything up there had shifted in the years since we last touched it. The attic smelled like dust and forgotten summers. The slanted ceiling forced me to duck as I stepped inside. Boxes lined the rafters, Christmas ornaments, old tools, a cracked tackle box we never managed to throw away. In the far corner, half covered by a canvas cloth, sat something I hadn't noticed in years, my husband's old toolbox. Heavy metal, the latch slightly rusted. I knelt beside it and brushed away the dust. The moment I lifted the lid, a familiar scent hit me, machine oil and cedar shavings, the scent of every project he'd ever started but never finished. Inside, everything was exactly where he'd left it. Tape measure, small hammer, a fishing knife wrapped in cloth, and beneath it, tucked flat against the bottom, a sealed envelope. My initials written in his handwriting, CL. My throat tightened. I sat back on my heels, listening to the storm hammer the roof as I carefully tore open the flap. Inside was a folded blueprint. But not of the original cabin. This one showed an expansion, a second room, widened porch, reinforced foundation, updated stove hood. His notes colored the margins. For long stays. For winter months. For when she needs space that no one can take from her. He always meant for me to stay, not visit, stay. My eyes burned, but the tears didn't fall, not yet. There was too much inside me shifting, aligning into something fiercer than grief. Lightning flashed through the attic window, lighting the blueprint like a prophecy. And that's when I heard it. A single sharp crunch outside, not thunder, not branches. Footsteps on gravel, close. I held the blueprint to my chest as the attic floor vibrated faintly, the storm masking just enough sound to make the silence afterward even more precise. Someone was out there. Someone who didn't wait for storms to pass. I didn't sleep much after hearing those footsteps. The storm eventually drifted east, leaving the air washed clean and metallic, but my nerves stayed awake long after the thunder faded. By sunrise, the cabin was silent again, the kind of silence that tests your imagination. I stood on the porch with a mug of bitter coffee and scanned the gravel drive. Nothing, just pine needles, wet earth, and the faint scent of ozone. Whoever had been out there was gone. Or they never intended to knock. My phone buzzed on the kitchen table. I ignored it. After the night I'd had, I wasn't ready to let someone else's urgency dictate the temperature of my morning. I set the mug down, stretched my sore shoulders, and stepped outside to breathe in the cool air that still clung to the ground. A single bar of reception pinged at the top of my screen, just enough for messages to slip through. A new voicemail arrived, but the preview told me everything. Daniel, Eva, have you heard from Nana? It didn't surprise me that he was asking her. It surprised me that it had taken him this long. I didn't press play. I didn't need to hear his tone to know he would try to sound distressed and controlled at the same time, a performance honed from years of managing problems only when they threatened to spill into view. A few minutes later, another notification appeared. This one from Eva. Not a full message, just the small gray typing bubble blinking, then stopping, then blinking again. Finally, the text came through. Dad called, I told him no. Are you still okay? I stared at her words, the honesty tucked inside them. She wasn't asking where I was, she wasn't demanding, she was checking the one thing that mattered. For the last week I'd sent her a single emoji every night, nothing more, nothing less. A tree, evergreen tree. Our quiet code, letting her know I was safe without giving anyone the chance to intercept meaning. I replied the same way now. Evergreen tree. 3 seconds later, she liked the message, a tiny gesture, but one that filled the cabin with something warm and steady. Another voicemail dropped in from Daniel, the automated transcription garbled. We're worried. If something's wrong, please say so. But worry wasn't what he felt. Worry reaches, worry searches. This was discomfort, inconvenience, dressed up as concern. I let the message expire on the screen. Then I pulled open the drawer where I kept the old stationery I used for birthdays before text messages replaced thoughtfulness. I selected a postcard, the one with Lake Manistee at twilight, the water flat and violet like spilled ink. On the back I wrote, "Lake's lovely. Don't wait up. See." I drove the postcard into town and slid it into the outgoing mail slot beside the diner. Inside, the morning crowd had thinned. The same waitress with the cherry-red nails spotted me from behind the counter and lifted a pie tin wrapped in crinkled foil. "This is for you," she said, handing it over like a secret. I blinked. "For me?" She smiled. "Your husband tipped me big 10 years ago, said it was for putting up with his stories. Been saving a pie for you since I heard you were back." Her kindness hit me unexpectedly. Why? A small gesture, but it warmed a place in me I didn't know had gone cold. I thanked her, promised to return the baking tin, and stepped back into the sunlight. The day was bright and dry, the kind of day that made the world feel like it was being rebuilt plank by plank. I carried the pie home, set it on the counter, rolled up my sleeves, and walked into the yard. The soil behind the cabin was dark and loose from the storm. I dug small trenches and planted the vegetables I'd brought from home, tomatoes, basil, a few peppers. Kneeling in the dirt, hands deep in the earth, I felt something old tug loose from my chest. A sense of renewal, agency, the beginnings of a season that belonged to no one but me. When the garden was finished, I replaced the porch's broken screen door, the one my husband always meant to fix but never got around to. Each hinge, each screw felt like claiming another inch of my own space, my own life. Late afternoon settled softly across the lake. I washed my hands, poured a cup of tea, and stepped onto the porch, expecting quiet. But the quiet wasn't empty. A single envelope sat on the top step. No footprints in the dirt, no sound of a car, no sign of who left it. Just my name written in the center. And underneath, in tiny block letters, "We need to talk." Not Daniel's handwriting. Not Mara's. And not anyone I recognized. The envelope sat on my table like a dare. I didn't open it, not yet. Something in me wanted to set the tempo, not follow someone else's. Instead, I let it rest beneath the oil lamp while I made tea, letting the shadows flicker across the handwriting, unfamiliar, too neat, too deliberate. Whoever had left it knew exactly where to put it, so I couldn't pretend not to notice. But before I opened a strange future, I needed to look back at an old one. I went to the cabinet beside the fireplace, the one we rarely used except for storing things we meant to sort someday. Someday had suddenly come. Inside were loose stacks of photographs my husband and I kept in an unlabeled shoebox. I pulled it down, dust drifting up like soft ash. As I sifted through them, I found a picture I hadn't thought about in years. A hike near Sleeping Bear. Me in a red jacket. My husband grinning so wide his cheeks looked sunburned. Daniel, maybe 10 or 11, holding a walking stick that was clearly too big for him. The three of us looked unposed, unpracticed, whole. I turned the photo over, tracing the handwritten date on the back. Then I sat down hard because I remembered this picture not as it was but as Mara had displayed it once. On their hallway gallery wall, she'd printed a version of it on glossy canvas, except in her copy, I wasn't there. She had cropped the frame so tightly that only Daniel and his father remained. My red jacket, my presence sliced clean out of the image like an afterthought. At the time, I told myself it was the angle, the size, a simple aesthetic choice. But sitting alone in the quiet cabin, holding the original in both hands, I felt something colder settle in my chest. When exactly had I started disappearing from their story? I laid the photo flat on the table and swallowed against the thickness in my throat. There are losses you feel all at once, and there are losses that happen millimeter by millimeter until the final absence feels inevitable. I pulled a fresh envelope from the drawer and slipped the original photo inside. Then I wrote a short note on the back of an index card, my handwriting smaller and steadier than it had been in years. Never forget the full frame. Nana. I drove the letter to the small blue mailbox at the end of the cabin road. The metal was cool beneath my fingertips, the clink of the mail slot closing sharper than I expected. Sending that picture felt less like nostalgia and more like an anchor, something Eva could hold on to when the adults around her insisted on rewriting the truth. When I returned to the cabin, my phone buzzed with a notification I didn't ask for. Mara's newest post. A selfie, soft lighting, her hand pressed dramatically over her heart. Hoping all moms out there feel seen today. The performance was polished, hollow, her followers flooded the comments with heart emojis and praise. She basked in it the way she always did, as if sincerity were something you staged with proper lighting. I scrolled down until I saw Daniel's comment. Still haven't heard from mine. Underneath it, a sad face emoji. And beneath that, a line that said one reply. But when I tapped it, the reply was gone. Deleted. Of course it was. His discomfort was always meant to be private, mine, on the other hand, had been casually public for years. I set the phone aside, feeling an ache that was quite anger and wasn't quite resignation. Something more like acceptance, cold, clear, final. Outside, the light was fading again. I walked to the end of the cabin path where the old wooden mailbox stood, its paint peeling, the nameplate sty. LL bore the faded letters of our married name, Lorne, followed by my husband's initials. I unscrewed the tiny brass plate, polished the surface with my sleeve, and replaced it with a new one I had carved from a thin piece of pine. Lorne. Just that. Just mine. The air felt different after I tightened the last screw, quieter, as if the woods themselves recognized the shift. When I stepped back onto the porch, the envelope I'd left unopened on the table was no longer where I had placed it. It sat upright now, leaning against the lamp, as if someone had moved it. And beneath it, a new line of handwriting had been added in tiny, penciled script, so faint I had to lean in to read it. Before they arrive. I didn't touch the envelope again that night. I left it upright where it stood, the penciled warning "before they arrive" echoing through the cabin louder than the storm ever had. But by morning, nothing had changed. The woods looked unbothered. The porch was clean, no footprints, no sign of whoever had come close enough to leave it. Still, something in me understood. The stillness was temporary. By late morning, the sky had cleared into a pale, high blue. I set water to boil for tea, letting the kettle whistle through the silence when my phone buzzed with a string of notifications, too many, too quickly. Not from Daniel. Not from Eva. News alerts. I ignored them until the next buzz came with a familiar name, Traverse County Public Records. My hand stilled. I tapped the link. It wasn't a news article. It was a search activity receipt, a notification that someone had run a property lookup under my maiden name. There was only one person who would search both names out of desperation. Daniel. A hollow ache opened under my ribs. I could almost picture him at the kitchen table, laptop lit in the dim of their spotless house, his tone sharp with the kind of urgency that appears only when one's reputation begins to fray. Hours later, as if to confirm my suspicion, my phone buzzed again, this time with a voicemail transcription. "Mom, we found something, please call." I didn't. Because found something wasn't the same as understood anything. A few towns south, my absence was becoming inconvenient enough to investigate. A knock sounded suddenly, 3 firm, measured taps that didn't match Mara's dramatics or Daniel's impatience. I opened the door to find Sheriff Caldwell standing on my porch, hat in hand, cheeks wind-burned from the morning air. "Ms. Lorne," he said, voice low, "your son filed a missing persons report." I laughed without meaning to. The sound came out soft, almost tired. "I'm not missing," I said, "I'm just not answering the wrong people." He studied me for a long moment, the way seasoned lawmen do, carefully, respectfully, like he was reading something beyond posture or tone. "Mind if I step in?" he asked. I let him. He took a slow circle around the cabin, eyes scanning the walls, the windows, the steady rhythms of a life being lived rather than abandoned. He nodded to the oil lamps, the blueprint on the table, the garden shovel leaning near the door. "You safe here?" he finally asked. "Yes," I said simply. "You want to be here?" "I do." Caldwell exhaled through his nose, a quiet acceptance. Officially, there were procedures he had to follow. Unofficially, he seemed far more interested in what my silence meant than how it might be logged. "Off the record," he said, lowering his voice, "I get it." And I believed him. He tipped his hat, stepped back out onto the porch, and walked toward the gravel path. Before climbing into his cruiser, he glanced back. "I'll let them know you're fine," he said. "Doesn't mean they'll like the answer." After he drove off, the silence around the cabin felt heavier, not threatening, but inevitable. Lines had been drawn, records had been searched. The privacy I had reclaimed was no longer invisible. By dusk, my phone buzzed again, this time with a shared image Daniel had sent to Eva, which Eva then forwarded to me without comment. It was a screenshot of a county record entry, a property deed. My maiden name. The cabin's coordinates. Date of purchase 8 years earlier. Beneath it, Daniel's message to her. Why would she hide this from us? Eva hadn't replied to him. She had only forwarded it to me, accompanied by one quiet emoji, evergreen tree. I tucked my phone into my sweater pocket, stepped onto the porch, and watched the tree line for movement. The woods were still, but stillness didn't mean peace. The next morning, a soft rumble of an engine drifted up the mountain road, slow at first, then louder. I set my mug down, walked to the window, and pulled back the curtain. A silver SUV crawled up the ridge. Too polished for locals. Too hesitant for strangers. Daniel was driving. Maura sat stiffly beside him. My pulse didn't quicken, it settled. They reached the private road entrance just before the path dips toward the lake, and I watched from the distance as Daniel got out, confused, irritated, tugging at a heavy steel gate he hadn't known existed. The lock was new, I'd replaced it myself. He pulled harder. The gate didn't budge. He looked up toward the cabin, toward me, though he couldn't see me, and the entitlement in his expression washed over me like a cold tide. Mara stepped out next, adjusting her coat, peering up the hill as if expecting to be greeted. But there was no greeting. No invitation. No access. After a long moment, Daniel slammed his palm against the gate, frustration breaking through the facade he wore for the world. And from where I stood inside my cabin, I realized. They hadn't come to find me. They'd come to collect me. But they were too late. Far, far too late. Because just then, at my feet, the envelope shifted again. As if moved by a breeze that hadn't reached the inside of the cabin. And a new message, written in the same faint pencil, appeared beneath the original line. They won't be the only ones. Daniel didn't leave right away. From my window, I watched him pace beside the locked gate, phone pressed to his ear, gesturing in frustrated circles while Mara scrolled her screen like she was curating her own narrative of hardship. Eventually, he leaned against the SUV, exhaled hard, and lifted the phone again. A minute later, my voicemail pinged. I didn't play it at first. I made tea, sat at the table, and let the delay become my boundary. Finally, curiosity nudged at me, so I pressed the speaker button and set the phone beside my mug. His voice filled the cabin in a strained attempt at softness. "We're here, can we just talk, please?" Talk. Not apologize. Not understand. Not acknowledge. Just talk, the vague, formless request of someone who wants the symptoms to stop but not the cause to be examined. I let the message end on its own and closed the phone gently, as if handling something fragile but unimportant. Later, I wrote in my journal, the same leather one I'd carried for years, the spine worn soft enough to open on its own. Apologies born of discomfort aren't apologies. They're negotiations. The words looked stark against the page, but as soon as I wrote them, I felt something settle in me. I wasn't being cruel, I was being clear. By midday, I noticed Mara had posted again. A dark, moody story with her face half in shadow, voice trembling for effect. You give everything and they still shut you out. Her followers responded predictably, "You're so strong, sending love, family is hard." But none of them knew the truth beneath the carefully arranged lighting and wounded sincerity. Far from that digital echo chamber in their quiet kitchen back in town, Eva stayed silent. She didn't join her mother's pity campaign. She didn't defend or condemn. She simply stayed quiet, a silence that said more than anything she could have typed. I texted her a simple tree emoji again, evergreen tree, but didn't expect a reply. Sometimes children carry truths they don't yet have words for. Sometimes silence is the only rebellion they can afford. That afternoon, I drove into town, needing to be around people whose expectations of me began and ended with the present moment. The lakeside cafe was warm and bright, sunlight glinting off the water through its wide windows. A handwritten sign on the door read Book Club Thursdays AT4, and without thinking, I stepped inside. A cluster of women sat around a long table, mugs in hand, books stacked in messy piles. Laughter floated through the room, warm, unguarded, unstrategized. The kind of laughter I hadn't been near in years. A woman with silver-streaked hair looked up and smiled. "You here for book club?" I hesitated, then nodded. "If you'll have me." "Of course, I'm Janice, pull up a chair." I sat down, feeling strangely exposed in a room full of strangers. When introductions circled to me, I paused, breath held for a heartbeat. "My name's Caroline," I said. "Not Carolyn. Not Mom. Not Nana. Just Caroline, who I had been long before anyone needed me to be anything else." The group accepted the name easily, without question, without the weight of history attached to it. They welcomed me into their discussion, passed muffins down the table, asked about my thoughts on the book without fishing for anything deeper. It felt like exhaling into a life that wasn't defined by obligation. As the sun dipped lower, turning the lake bronze, I realized how rare it was to be seen without being interpreted. When the meeting ended, Janice touched my arm gently. "Come back next week," she said. "We rotate who brings cookies. If you're willing, you can be week 3. I smiled. "I'd like that." Driving back up the winding road to my cabin, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: anticipation. Not dread, not preparation for conflict, just quiet anticipation of something small and good. But that feeling cracked the moment I stepped onto the porch. The envelope from the table, the one with the penciled warnings, was lying on the porch floorboards now, angled diagonally across the wood. The windows were locked. The door had been shut. No wind strong enough had passed through. I bent to pick it up, a cold tightness forming in my chest. A new line had been added beneath the last message. "Tomorrow." Just that. And beneath it, pressed hard enough to dent the paper. "Be ready." I barely slept after reading the words "tomorrow, be ready." The message felt less like a threat and more like a nudge from the past, a reminder that the choices I'd been making weren't floating in isolation. They were landing, they were echoing, and someone somewhere was close enough to notice. By morning, the fear had eased into something steadier: resolve. I drove into town with a list folded neatly in my pocket, not errands, intentions. The first stop was a brick building near the courthouse, painted a soft sage green with a simple sign: Harbor House, support for elder women. I'd passed it for years but had never gone inside. Today, the door felt like a threshold I was finally ready to cross. A woman in her 50s, warm-eyed denim jacket, greeted me. "Looking for assistance?" she asked gently. "No," I said, "looking to help." We sat in a small office with shelves lined with pamphlets and mismatched mugs. I told her I wanted to make an anonymous donation, flexible, unrestricted funds, the kind that didn't need my name attached to do good. She listened without prying, without asking where the money came from or why I felt compelled. When I handed her the sealed envelope with a portion of my retirement savings, she pressed her palm over it as if absorbing its weight. "This will change lives," she whispered. I nodded. "That's the idea." Walking out of the building into the crisp air, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in years, the feeling of building something without being watched, without seeking approval, without leaving room for anyone to take credit but the women it would help. Back at the cabin, I pulled the estate binder toward me again, turning to the section labeled Beneficiary Access Codes. Holly's had left several blank pages for notes, recommendations, contingencies. I took out a pen and began writing a final addendum, my hand steady as I spelled out the condition. Eva will receive access to the cabin upon her 18th birthday. A handwritten code will be provided only to her. No guardians, no intermediaries, no exceptions. Love was the qualifier now, not order of birth, not DNA, not assumption. She had shown up in the only ways a girl her age could. That was enough. I tucked the page into the binder, then walked to the bedroom and opened the small cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Inside lay my high school retirement ring, a simple gold band engraved with my initials, a piece of who I'd been before the decades folded in around me. I placed it inside a hand-carved wooden box my husband had made during one of his long winters here. On the lid, I taped a small label I'd written that morning. For the one who showed up. No names, no need. Around mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed with an email from Daniel, short, stiff, exhausted. "We're heading home. I don't know what to say anymore." I stared at it for a long moment, feeling none of the tug I expected. Once, his exhaustion would have cracked me open. Once, the words "I don't know what to say" would have made me rush to fill the silence for him. "Not now." I typed a single reply. "You had many chances. I had to take one back." I hit send before I could soften it. Softening is what had gotten us here. For a while after, the cabin was quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like ground settling after an earthquake, not peaceful exactly, but forming something new. I walked outside to breathe the pine-heavy air, to check the garden bed, to remind myself that life existed beyond the weight of family narratives. The sun dipped low, streaking the treetops with amber light. When I returned, something on the porch railing caught my eye. Another envelope. Not ins. I'd this time. Not moved mysteriously. Placed openly, intentionally, squarely on the rail where no wind could have delivered it. The handwriting was the same thin, careful script as before. But this time the front didn't have my name. It had Eva's. My chest tightened. I slid my thumb beneath the flap and opened it with a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Inside was one single sheet of paper, no message, no explanation, just a printed screenshot. A timestamp location pin. Coordinates. My coordinates. Sent from Daniel's phone. Forwarded to an unknown number. Then printed. Someone else, someone Daniel trusted, had asked for my location. Someone he hadn't told me about. And beneath the pin, a final line written in pencil. Tomorrow wasn't about them. The envelope with the printed coordinates stayed on my desk for 2 days before I finally put it away. Not because I wasn't curious, but because I refused to let someone else's secrecy dictate the pace of my days. If Daniel had shared my location with someone, it wasn't a threat, it was a pattern. He'd always turn to outside validation when he didn't understand something close to him. And the message, tomorrow wasn't about them, felt less ominous the longer I sat with it, more like a reminder that my choices had consequences beyond the edges of my old life. Weeks passed. Not a single call. Not one email. Not even one of Mara's public displays of half-stitched concern. Just stillness. And I didn't miss the noise. The cabin settled into a rhythm I hadn't known I craved. Morning light through the east window, the lake whispering against the shore, the soft groan of the wooden floors as if the place were stretching with me. I spent the first week repairing the dock, replacing warped planks, sanding the edges smooth enough to walk barefoot. The physical work steadied me, my arms ached, my hands blistered, but every strike of the hammer felt purposeful, like I was stitching my way back into my own skin. When the dock was done, I learned how to stain wood from a neighbor down the road who had a knack for restoring old fishing boats. He showed me how to mix the oil, how to brush with the grain, how to listen for the shift in tone when the wood was ready to drink it in. His kindness was easy, unperformed. By week 3, I'd started taking morning swims again, slow laps in the cool, glassy water before the sun warmed the surface. The shock of the cold always stole my breath in the best way, washing the night's weight off me. I'd climb out dripping, toes numb, heart steady, and feel more alive than I had in years. The local kids who fished off the public pier started waving when they saw me walking by. Eventually, they started hollering Miss C, as if the nickname had always existed. One morning, I brought them a tin of muffins, blueberry, slightly overbaked, and the oldest boy grinned like I'd handed him treasure. "You're the muffin lady now," he announced. I didn't mind the title. Another afternoon, while I was dragging fallen branches to the burn pile, a neighbor from the northern lot, a man named Russell, broad-shouldered with a laugh like loose gravel, wandered over and invited me to a harvest dinner the community held every October. I almost declined out of habit, but something in me tugged toward yes. That night, under strings of warm backyard lights surrounded by bowls of roasted squash and platters of venison stew, I laughed more than I had in a decade. Not polite laughter, not family gathering laughter meant to smooth tension, real laughter, the kind that rises from the chest without permission. I caught myself wondering how many years I'd spent quieting that sound. On a Wednesday afternoon, as I sat on the porch mending a tear in the seat cushion, my phone buzzed. "Eva, a simple text. I used the compass today, just wanted you to know." I smiled before I even realized I was smiling. I pictured her holding the brass compass I'd given her when she was 9, the one she kept in her backpack even when she stopped liking little kid things. It wasn't the object that mattered, it was the way she carried small truths the adults around her overlooked. I typed back, "That's how you find yourself." 3 dots blinked for a moment, then disappeared. I didn't need a reply. Sometimes the important things don't echo back, they simply land. Later, as the sky warmed into shades of amber and plum, I sat on the new porch steps, letting the quiet settle over me. The woods hummed with insects, the lake glinted through the trees, and for a moment everything felt aligned, not repaired, not redeemed, but aligned. I'd been waiting weeks for another envelope to appear. None had. Not on the railing. Not on the porch. Not at the foot of the steps. But just as I stood to go inside, something caught my eye at the far end of the gravel path, a flash of white tucked against the base of the mailbox post. Not placed. Not delivered. Dropped. Something car. Wide there by the wind, or by someone who hadn't wanted to come any closer. I walked down the path slowly, my heartbeat steady but alert. A single sheet of paper fluttered against the grass. Not folded. Not sealed. Just one sentence printed across the center in the same thin, careful script as before. "This part you'll have to do alone." The breeze lifted the corner. And for the first time in weeks, the woods didn't feel empty. The note at the mailbox stayed in my pocket for days. I didn't show it to anyone, didn't analyze the handwriting, didn't speculate who had left it. I simply honored the part I understood. This part you'll have to do alone. Alone wasn't a threat. Alone was a direction. And for the first time in my life, it didn't feel like abandonment, it felt like agency. So when the invitation arrived from the Traverse City Community Center, a polite email from the program director asking if I would read an excerpt from the memoir I had quietly begun drafting, I said yes without hesitation. The memoir wasn't finished, not even close, but there were pages I was ready to claim out loud. On the evening of the event, the sky was a crystalline autumn blue, the kind that feels like it might shatter with the first hint of winter wind. I parked 2 blocks away and walked slowly toward the building, clutching my pages in a manila folder. My heart wasn't racing, my hands weren't trembling, my breath was steady. Inside, the auditorium was modest, maybe 50 chairs, half filled with local readers, retirees, a few young writers clutching their notebooks as if hoping someone would give them permission to begin. Janice from book club spotted me first. "Caroline," she waved, bright and warm, "you look ready." "I think I am," I said, surprised by how true it felt. I took my place at the podium while the last few attendees settled in. The microphone hummed softly, I straightened my pages, the room quieted. And just as I lifted my eyes, the back door opened. Daniel walked in first. Mara behind him. Both froze when they saw me standing at the podium. He looked stunned, as if witnessing a version of me he'd never imagined existed without him. She looked pale, uncertain, off balance in a way I had never seen. They sat in the very back row, shoulders stiff, hands folded as if bracing for impact. I didn't flinch. Not even a fraction. I looked down at my first page, breathed once, and began. Some people lose their mothers, some just never bothered to look. The room went still. I didn't look at them, I didn't need to, their presence no longer dictated the direction of my voice. I continued reading, letting the sentences land where they needed to, not sharp, not vengeful, just true. Stories about the quiet ways a woman disappears when no one bothers to see her. The years spent softening herself into a shape that fit others. The moment she finally realized that silence wasn't peace, it was erasure. On the fourth page, I read the line that had come to me one night in the cabin, written in the margins of a draft I hadn't intended to share. You don't have to raise your voice to leave. A murmur swept through the room, not shock but recognition. I heard someone shift in the back row. A soft exhale. A whispered "oh" from Mara. I kept reading. 5 more minutes. 2 more pages. When I finished, the applause rose slowly at first, then stronger, fuller, warm enough to carry through the rafters. A few women stood, someone whistled softly, Janice clapped with her whole body. Out of instinct, I glanced toward the back. Mara sat frozen, eyes glossy, mascara smudged at the corner. She leaned toward Daniel, whispering something that trembled out of her. She didn't write this for us. For once she was right. Daniel didn't speak. His hands were clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. I couldn't read his expression, not anger, not sadness, something in between, something he hadn't built language for yet. I gathered my pages, stepped off the stage, and walked down the aisle. Past the chairs. Past the readers. Past the podium where I'd left a piece of my old self behind. When I reached the back row, I didn't look at either of them. Not out of cruelty. Out of clarity. I walked right past them, steady, unhurried, unflinching, and pushed through the exit doors into the cool night air. Outside, the lamps along the sidewalk flickered in the breeze. Cars hummed distantly. The world continued, indifferent and generous all at once. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. A single text. From an unknown number. No threats. No instructions. Just 2 words. Almost done. I stared at the screen, breath calm, heart steady. Whoever had been leaving those notes, they weren't finished. And neither was I. The text, almost done, stayed on my phone like a stone in my pocket, but nothing followed it. No more envelopes, no more coordinates, no one waiting at the gate or driving through town with questions ready. Instead, life settled again, soft around the edges, as if the world understood I needed a different kind of quiet now. A week after the reading, an envelope from my publisher arrived in the cabin mailbox. I stood on the porch with the unopened letter, feeling its weight, surprisingly light for something so symbolic. Inside, the check was modest, almost laughably so, but the number didn't matter. What mattered was the line at the top. Royalty statement, first printing. I held it between my fingers like a small flame that refused to go out. Back inside, I pulled my wedding photo from the bookshelf, the one where my husband was laughing mid-blink because the photographer had said something absurd. His smile was soft and crooked, the way I loved it best. I placed the photo in a simple wooden frame and set the check beside it, sliding both onto the mantel. His smile made the check feel less like money and more like a promise fulfilled. The cabin had taken shape around me in ways I hadn't expected. New screens on the windows, freshly sealed wood, shelves stocked with groceries I didn't have to label or hide, every blanket folded the way I liked, every corner free from the clutter of other people's demands. It was a place made entirely of decisions that belonged only to me. In the small act of choosing myself, I'd built something whole. One evening, with the fire flickering low, I opened my contacts list on my phone. Daniel's name sat at the top, familiar, heavy, a presence even in its silence. Mara's name just below it, aggressive in its neatness. I hovered for a beat, not out of doubt but acknowledgement. Then I deleted both. Not out of rage. Not out of finality. Out of relief, a quiet reclaiming of space that had been clogged for years by expectation. A few hours later, a message from Eva appeared, her typing dots blinking before the words finally formed. Can I visit someday? Not can Dad bring me? Not is it okay with Mom? Just her, a question asked from the center of herself. I took a long breath, then typed. If you bring questions, not apologies. She hearted the message, nothing more, it was enough. The next morning, a cool wind swept across the lake, the kind that smells faintly of leaves about to turn. I walked through the woods behind the cabin, tracing the paths my husband and I once walked, the ones we'd always promised to revisit when life settled down. It never did, so I was doing it now. The branches shifted overhead, dappling the ground with patterns of light. I felt the pull of the years I had given to others, all those seasons of waiting for permission to take up space. And beneath that, the solid, steady truth that I didn't need permission anymore. I followed the trail until it opened to the lake where the dock stretched out like a quiet invitation. I sat at the edge, toes skimming the cold surface, breath rising in small clouds. Pulling my journal from my jacket pocket, I wrote a single line across the fresh page. This was the year I was born again. The words surprised me, not their meaning, but their certainty. There was no hesitation in them, no caveat, just truth. I closed the journal and let the silence settle around me, soft as a second skin. Then my phone buzzed. Not an unknown number. Not Daniel. Not Murrah. A county alert, a simple notification from the sheriff's office. Public notice, a vehicle was found abandoned near Route 7. No driver located, investigation ongoing. A chill slid down my spine. Route 7 was the road that led to my cabin. And it was the same road Daniel had driven weeks earlier. The woods behind me rustled, not ominously, just enough to remind me that quiet never meant untouched. I stood slowly, phone warm in my hand, heart steady but alert. Whoever was almost done might not have been talking about me at all. 1 year later, Mother's Day arrived without ceremony. No buzzing phone, no calendar reminder flashing red, no one checking if I was available for brunch or photos or the careful choreography of a family pretending to function. Just morning light slipping across the cabin floorboards, quiet and gold. And me awake, unhurried, unclaimed. Outside, the trees had leafed out fully, a soft green canopy that stirred with every light breeze. I boiled water for tea, the kettle sighing in that familiar, steady rhythm I'd come to love. When I reached for my mug, I noticed the envelope propped beside it, the one Eva had sent earlier that week, written in her looping handwriting. I opened it gently, the paper warm from the sun through the window. Nana, I got the scholarship, the art one. I can go wherever I choose. Thank you for teaching me that being seen starts with seeing yourself. I smiled, the kind that presses into your bones. Her voice on the page was clearer than most spoken words had ever been. I poured my tea, sat on the porch steps, and read the letter again, slower this time, savoring each line. She had found her compass, I had found mine. By Joe. I celebrated alone, not lonely, just whole. Back inside, a small stack of boxes waited near the fireplace. Copies of my book. My memoir had become a modest bestseller across northern Michigan, not a phenomenon, just something steady, something people passed between friends in quiet understanding. The cover showed a single pine tree against a winter sky. Eva had sketched it for me. That morning, I had a scheduled phone interview with a local reporter who was doing a 1 year later feature on authors with unexpected success. We spoke for 20 minutes of writing process, the cabin, the lake, the way solitude had reshaped my days. Then she asked the question they all reached for eventually. Did your family ever apologize? I could hear her holding her breath, waiting for a tender soundbite she could turn into a headline. I didn't give her one. They'll have to read the book, I said. There was a pause on the line, the kind that signals truth, not dismissal. When the interview ended, I felt lighter than I had in years. After lunch, I stepped outside to admire the cabin, no longer a refuge I'd fled to, but a home I had built into myself. The new brass plate on the porch gleamed in the afternoon sun. I reached out and touched the engraved words. The second start. My husband would have understood. He had handed me the key before I ever realized I needed a door. A few local kids biked past, waving as they headed toward the lake. "Have a nice day, Miss C," they called, their voices bright as wind chimes. I waved back, heart warm. Later, with the sun lowering toward the tree line, I took my notebook onto the dock. The boards were firm beneath my feet, the ones I'd replaced myself, and the water below was a glassy reflection of sky. I opened to a fresh page and wrote the final line of the final chapter. They never looked for me where I was becoming. I set my pen down and let the words rest. Becoming had taken time, boundaries, distance, even fear, but it had also taken kindness from strangers, from neighbors, from Eva, from the parts of myself I'd buried beneath decades of obligation. Becoming had been worth every fracture endured along the way. The wind shifted slightly, sending small ripples across the lake. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a car engine murmured, brief, distant, then gone. Not a threat, not a warning, just the world moving around me instead of through me. I closed the notebook and held it in my lap, breathing in pine and lake and the faint scent of spring wildflowers tucked along the shoreline. The life I had now wasn't loud or grand or polished. It was something far rarer. It was mine. As the light thinned, I whispered the final line of my story aloud, not for an audience, not for forgiveness, not for remembrance, but for truth. They forgot Mother's Day, I found myself. And the world around me, the lake, the trees, the quiet, answered in the only way it needed to. By staying.